I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this panel because of the people that will be speakers on it, and also because it's a special day. The IPCC has been, as it has rightly been said, has been releasing its report today, this evening. It's not really a good news, but at least it makes all the difference on what we're going to talk about it. The topic of this roundtable is the contribution of infrastructure to the climate 2 degrees objective. We are far away from this objective today, and we're going to see how all my guests are going to react. Please, because the nature of the people and the institutions they do represent, high profiles, namely, and I'll start with Emmanuel Matz from Head of Energy and Infrastructure at Proparco, Xavier Gir, Group Senior Executive Vice President from EDF, Nicolas Medigo, CEO of Marguerite, the fund, Olivier Sichel, Deputy CEO of La Caisse des Dépôts, Philippe Zawoti, CEO of Mirova, everybody knows him, and Jean-Marc Jancovici, founding partner of Carbon 4. I'll start very briefly. We have an hour, so many people on the ground. We'll try to make it live. My first question is obviously, we all have read briefly the IPCC, let's say, survey of this morning or heard about it. I'd like to understand better how each of your institutions are encapsulating or are positioning themselves vis-à-vis the climate issues. And we'll start with the largest producer ever. So please, Xavier, can you tell us a bit more about the climate as a mainstream of your business now?
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you today. As far as EDF is concerned, in fact, I mean, the climate change is at the heart of our strategy. Of course, it's not a surprise, I guess, for anybody here. First, as an investor, we are a key investor in this field. As a generator, we invest more or less 10 billion euros per year in decarbonized technologies, both nuclear and renewables, including hydro, of course. And of course, this is key in our strategy, the name of which is CAP 2030. And we invest also in the distribution networks in order to accelerate also the energy efficiency, particularly through smart meters investments. So as a whole, clearly, low carbon energy is clearly at the heart of EDF strategy. Secondly, we develop usages in order to develop smart homes, smart industry, in particular through services. We have a dedicated subsidiary, the name of which is Dalkia, and many different other initiatives. For example, we work currently, really currently, on storage in order to develop a new usage with a low carbon goal. And third point, I would like to highlight very briefly to match Pedro's requirement, we commit, and we commit the whole company. We have already reduced by 40% our CO2 generation between 2013 and 2017. And we have this year announced another commitment, an additional 40% decrease between now and 2030. In order to reach a total generation within the group of 30 million tons of carbon. So as you see, it's clearly at the heart of our strategy, both through investment, usages, commitments, and it's very consistent with what we are, because EDF, as you know, wants to be, in the long run, the leader in the low carbon electricity and energy.
Thank you. Maybe one question to Olivier Sichel. I mean, you're probably probably the largest asset owner in France, and specifically in infrastructure. Can you tell us a bit more about your views on the climate and how you encapsulate this in your strategy?
Yes, well, you're right, Caisse des Dépôts, as a financial institution, was in the first signatories of the Global Compact. So we made a commitment to put this intervention capacity compliant with the objective of sustainable development made by the UN. Moreover, we're part of the Carbon European Fund. We also launched a very interesting subsidiary called CDC Biodiversity, which is concerning the economy development of the biodiversity. We also launched last year the first green bond of $500 million, and systematically in the as a shareholder, we take part to the AGM, taking into consideration all the climate action consideration, and we're also challenging the CEO of the listed companies where we're investors. And more recently, when we launched the Banque des Territoires, which is the single brand that is unifying all the levels of development of territories, we took a strong commitment to have the assessment of all our actions according to the Sustainable Development Objective, according to UN. You know, since IRA was not our single way of assessing our action, because we where the market is not. If the market can invest, there's no reason for Banque des Territoires to be present. So the way we take in consideration of how do we accept a lower IRA is also taking into consideration this sustainable development. So when we go more precisely in the type of action we're funding, so we'll find transport infrastructure and helping public transportation system, especially the one including green car fleets or electric batteries, including also the supply concern. Real estate, we're very present in the social housing, and we make sure that the social housing is taking into consideration all what is related to the energy efficiency. And as energy, we're one of the high-profile investors in renewable energy. Would it be wind, offshore, hydro, or biogas? All these type of things, especially local, we're taking that into consideration.
Thank you. Jean-Marc, please, from Carbon 4. I know you've been creating your consultant company more than 10 years ago, if I'm right. Okay, so 10 years ago, climate was sort of a, I don't know what exactly. I mean, nobody cares at that time.
It was a UFO.
Yeah, exactly. Now it's becoming really mainstream to all of us, I guess, and it should be. What can you tell us a bit, maybe with an historic view, that would be, I think, helpful to everybody?
Actually, what we try to do is to perform the difficult job of putting physics back into economics, which is something which is difficult. As you may know, the figures that you are manipulating every day, say euros or dollars or whatever, currencies, do not include the damage that we do to the natural assets, because by convention, any physical resource is free in the economic system that we use, by convention. It was stated 2 centuries ago. So you cannot assess the harm or the good that you do to natural assets, the climate system being one of them, just looking at euros. You have to use separate accounting. And what we do at Carbon 4 is establish that accounting regarding emissions. We have begun also to assess the resilience to a future climate change. And what we do is confront activities to know whether they can survive in a world that would either decrease the emissions very quickly. And one figure that you should keep in mind is that the 2-degree objective comes along with a 5% decrease of the world emissions each year, starting tomorrow until 2050. Less 5% per year. There are 2 years in the course of the 20th century where we have witnessed such a decrease rate. 1945, that is Germany and Japan being destroyed. And 1932, that is the maximum of the 29 crisis. 2 years. All the other years, the emissions have risen by something. Or very slightly decreased. So it's a true challenge. It's not something which is going to come just like this. And the reason why is that we have put machinery to work everywhere, and this machinery is working with fossil fuels. So the reason why we have increased productivity is because we use machines everywhere. So what we try to do in Carbon 4 is confront activities to, in a way, a decrease of the Superman costume that we all have. That's what we do. We also try to confront activities to the embedded climate change, because another thing that, this is physics, that one should keep in mind, is that CO2 is an oxide, dioxide of carbon. And oxides are very stable in the environment, very stable. Actually, there are molecules that can remain for 1 billion years. So once you put CO2 into the atmosphere, The time that you have to wait until it's totally evacuated is over 10,000 years. If tomorrow the emissions came down to zero, we should wait for 10,000 years, actually more, for all the surplus of CO2 that we have already created to be evacuated from the atmosphere. So there is no reset button, and we are going, it's only the beginning of the consequences that we are seeing right now, whatever we do. It's only the beginning. Just over 2 degrees, we will begin the dismantling of the West Antarctic ice sheet. We have already begun the melting of Greenland, so just wait, and Netherlands will be underwater. So a couple of centuries. So I don't know what the damage of Netherlands being underwater at a 4% or 5% discount rate is worth today in a couple of centuries, but it's just a matter of time. So that's what we do at Carbon 4. We try to confront our present economic activities with the time horizons that you all know in this room to this process which spans over very long time frames, a huge inertia, and something which is most of the time beyond the reach of classical economics. So we have a thrilling but difficult task.
Jose, we see you and we feel you very optimistic, although. Nicolas, you're CEO of Marguerite, which was one of the first public initiatives on the investment side. Could you tell us a bit more about how do you encapsulate once again the climate in your strategies?
Thanks, Pedro. Well, first of all, just a few words about Marguerite and how we've contributed to climate change. Marguerite was set up in 2010 by the European Investment Bank, CDC, and several other national promotional banks to invest in greenfield infrastructure in the EU, primarily renewables and other energy infrastructure and transport. As of today, we have now invested in 22 projects across 13 EU member states, of which about half are renewables in 8 different countries in Europe, including offshore wind, onshore wind, solar PV, biomass, energy from waste. We've also invested recently in energy efficiency by acquiring a company that is building out municipal lighting, LED lighting throughout Italian cities. So we have about 1.2 gigawatts that we have contributed to being built. We were early investors in offshore wind in Belgium and Germany. So we kind of pioneered investment by infrastructure funds in that particular subsector, which has in turn driven a lot of demand from, well, first of all, cost reduction, and then demand from all kinds of infrastructure investors. So we've tried to act as a catalyst, working on more difficult projects, either in more tricky jurisdictions or technologies. Usually we bring in other types of investors alongside us, private institutional investors. And in our first fund, once we finished building and these assets were already operating, we sold a group of those assets to a private institutional investor. So part of our work is to get assets built and then move them to the private sector. We raised a second fund at the end of last year for another 700 million euros. And we're basically doing the same thing. The framework has changed dramatically. It's a very different environment for investing in renewables now because the technology prices have gone down a lot. There are no longer feed-in tariffs. So the whole framework is very different. But we're working in that framework successfully. There's a huge amount of infrastructure funds, capital that is available to invest in renewables. And the key is to get that money into projects, not just in the Western European countries, but also in the more peripheral type jurisdictions. So for example, in Eastern Europe, where there's a big pending task of transitioning out of coal. So we're trying to work in all the different jurisdictions, not just the most attractive or developed ones like, you know, for example, France and Germany, but there are many other European countries that need to invest more in renewables. So we're trying to help that.
Thank you. At Proparco, Emmanuel, sorry, it's not obvious to imagine that as your institution is devoted to emerging countries, that the climate is already something that you have on the forefront. Can you tell us a bit more about this? And sorry if I've been a bit aggressive on that question, but...
Sure, thank you, and very happy to be with you this afternoon. Just a few words on Proparco. Proparco is the French arm of French Development Agency dedicated to the private sector, and our aim is to support the development in emerging countries. And I won't bother you with figures, but just for you to know, we on a yearly basis, our target is to achieve 2 billion new commitments per year in 2 years' time. Representing, whilst our parent company is 12 billion, so just to provide you an indicative of figures. And for us, the focus we do have is since 2010, so the birth of Margaret, we have decided to dedicate 30% of our annual commitments to projects with a benefit to climate change. So this is not brand new. This is something we started to pay attention almost 10 years ago now, and we do have that that challenging role to support and to achieve and to contribute to that sustainable development goals, whilst at the same time taking into consideration that climate change is key for all of us. So, as explained, those 30% commitments or annually commitments have been done for almost 10 years, and we are going on following this route. But since last year, we have decided to go forward, and at the level of French Development Agency, to try to finance 100% of our projects that could fit with the Accords de Paris that were taken at the COP21. And what does this mean? That would mean that we pay a specific attention to the indices each country has taken in order to decrease its emission and in order to enter into a low carbon credit development trajectory. And we assist them, and we assist the private sector to support the efforts and commitments of those countries to achieve those. The first thing we do, and we will be going on, will be to scaling up renewable energy, so in order to have electricity mix getting greener and greener, and we see that this is most achieved in the majority of the countries, but still there is a need for scaling up, and we will be going on supporting that. We are active as well in a few projects of adaptation, especially in the water field. So when and we are supporting, for instance, water companies in Brazil, in China, which are very active in areas where the stress hydric is very high, in order to limit those impacts as well. And of course, we cannot achieve those sustainable goals without investing and without supporting infrastructure, which is somehow emissive project. So we have decided since the beginning of the year to pay further attention to those emissive projects and to analyze them more properly on the basis of taking into consideration first that they do enter into the national commitments the countries have taken or not. And if they don't, and if they are so emissive, we will carry some studies in order to see whether they don't unlock the trajectory of development of those countries in very emissive ways on a long-run basis. So this is very challenging because, of course, for big transportation infrastructure, the challenge is obvious. But we are quite successful, and we have entered, along with our parent company, into dialogues with some countries in order to focus on the main infrastructure that could be the lower emissive and the lowest emissive possible. And if emissive, to engage the countries to take measures in order to lower their emissions on other sectors of their development.
Thank you. Philippe Zawati, sorry. I mean, we all know that you've been, for years, one of the thought leaders in making the climate a topic that hopefully we discuss today, maybe one day earlier in the day. But clearly, I mean, thanks to you, it makes it possible. How do you feel today after having reviewed the report that was disclosed yesterday? And I'm sure then you'll talk about Mirova, but I think the audience will be glad to hear about what you're feeling.
Yeah, I mean, how can you think I'm feeling? I mean, clearly we need to accelerate much more than we are doing today. And I mean, this is by the way, this is I think a big issue of all the conferences we are attending week after week in New York, San Francisco, or Paris. We are just enumerating all the initiative we are taking, and there are a lot, and we are collectively doing a lot. But can we say that we are in the good trajectory of 2 degrees or 1.5? Clearly not. So I'm very happy that this topic is today at the heart of the Infrastructure Week, because clearly, maybe for 2 reasons. The first one is that when we launched Mirova 5 years ago, we decided to put all the asset classes into. I mean, it was an asset management company dedicated to responsible investments, and we decided to do it with a strong conviction on one hand, but also across asset classes, and including infrastructures. And in infrastructures, not only renewable energy, but also core infrastructure. And a lot of people clearly said to me at that time, I mean, do you really think it's a good idea? I mean, infrastructure is about highways, it's about airports. There is nothing to do with responsible investment in infrastructure. And clearly, the fact that today this is the main topic of this conference is something very important, because it's of course a main issue for the infrastructure business. Not only because most of the infrastructure that we need to build has something to do with the energy and ecological transition, but also because the other infrastructure which already exists that we are buying, like also highways and airports, they will clearly be hit to a certain point by the climate change, by the extreme weather events, and so on. So we not only have to integrate the climate in the way we invest, and to invest in new sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy efficiency, and so on, but also to take into account the adaptation and the resilience of the infrastructure in the coming decades, and so integrate not only the carbon risk but the physical risk of the infrastructure. So this is the first reason why I'm happy about this today. And the second reason is that is because infrastructure and climate finance are probably two very important advantages. I mean, core advantages of the Paris marketplace. And as you know, we have launched 1 year ago Finance for Tomorrow. Finance for Tomorrow is the Paris initiative for green and sustainable finance. We have now about 60 members from all the horizons, all the players of the marketplace. And we have started a couple of works on at Finance for Tomorrow, especially on new innovative financing schemes including blended finance, public-private partnership, which is certainly, as you said, I mean, Olivier and Nicolas, I mean, it's very important for the development of infrastructure, not only in our countries, in developed countries, but also in developing countries. But we can come back to this maybe later on.
Yes, with pleasure. Well, I think why not now? Because I would like you to better explain maybe one of two things of your methodology, and maybe because that's the main question that we need to sort partially today, which is what contribution can infrastructure offer to the 2-degree objective? What kind of innovation do we need to put on the table? Because if we read correctly, the report of the CIPC, we're going to see that basically there are so many things to do. What should we do actually? Because what we've done apparently has very limited effect.
The issue that we need to invest much more, clearly. The methodologies, I mean, we all know, we all use, I mean, about the same things. I mean, we measure the carbon footprint of the portfolio. We have to measure now the physical risk of our infrastructure. We were on all our portfolio, the 10 billions managed by Mirova. We say that we are 2 degrees compliant. So this is something that we have measured. So we are in this trajectory, but it's not enough. I mean, we need clearly to redirect a lot of money into sustainable infrastructure. The issue is that, yes, there are a lot of appetite for infrastructure, as you said, but I mean, all the investors want exactly the same thing. I mean, mature infrastructure in mature countries, and so this is the big problem. So we have, of course, the problem of the investment in emerging countries. And this is the topic of Proparco and AFD. And we at Mirova, we have, for example, some very interesting initiatives. I mean, going on in the area of natural capital, of investing in rehabilitation of land, and we need public money in order to de-risk these assets, in order to mobilize and to attract private money. Because if not, the private investors will not come. But probably, my intuition is that we can also do the same thing in developed countries. In France, the issue we have is not really about innovation. We know how to finance innovation, but we have an issue about the putting at scale a lot of things. I mean, putting at scale electric transportation, batteries. We are putting at scale biogas, putting at scale energy efficiency of housing, putting at scale agriculture, organic agriculture. So there is not. It's not a question of knowing, not a question of new technology, of knowing what to do, but we don't know how to put it really at scale. And to do that, we probably need also some public-private partnership and a public side to take more risk, maybe less volumes, but more risks.
Okay. Olivier Sichel, can I ask you to react on this? I mean, you know how to channel money, public money, and sometimes private money into this kind of project. How to accelerate on that front? And one or two examples would be helpful, I think.
Yes. Well, I totally agree with what Philippe said. I think as regard innovation, we've been able to sustain some very innovative initiative. Just give you were asking, for example, financing electric bus. We do that. We're also financing, the amenities for recharging this bus. We've been also helping funding innovative companies such as the hydrogen taxi companies, or some of you just came to Paris and you may have came across some blue scooter, which is electric scooters in a sharing way. But what we need is now scale. How we can make that all over the countries. And well, this type of conference helps for making all the public decision makers that this is possible. But it's a lot of financial engineering. For instance, we try to promote in France the interacting, where you are helping the public investors to make energy efficiency, and it's backed by the savings you do. But it's really hard, and it's a lack of culture, and probably a lack of financial culture, and how you can make public-private partnerships really work.
Yes, Xavier, please.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. I just wanted to add one point. I think what's key also is to organize a global context. I mean, for example, if we consider the solar technology in France, I mean, definitely we need to accelerate in photovoltaic and solar technologies. And in order to do that, we need first to have a legal frame, which has to be appropriate, I mean, with more significant tenders than what is organized today. We need to streamline all the legal procedures as regards claims, because today it takes a very long time, which is of course detrimental to the development of these technologies. And then we need some financing schemes, but it's not the most difficult, because when we have all these projects which give a clear visibility in the long run, we find how to finance them through public-private partnerships, through project financing, I mean, through partnerships with financing and industrial companies. Of course, we find how to finance them, but we need clearly a consistent context around these goals.
Just one word, maybe.
Yes, please.
It's always this question is about. I mean, do we have a problem of financing, or do we have a problem of is there enough project? It's the chicken and the egg, of course. But I don't think that if we only say there is not enough project, we won't do anything on the finance side. And we also do to do our homework on the finance side. I mean, putting more money on the table is also something important, because I mean, there are some assets which are not bankable, which are not really financial assets, which are projects. There are a lot of projects, there are a lot of needs, but the most difficult part is to transform this project into financial assets. And I think green finance is about this, is about creating a lot of green financial assets.
I mean, I fully agree, but just to take a very specific example, I mean, as regards once more the photovoltaic technology, we as EDF has taken a commitment to develop 30 gigawatt solar technology during the next 15 years. Of course, we commit to invest, and we have also contributed to an improvement of the legal framework in order to get to develop opportunities on a bigger scale, because otherwise it's not possible to invest in so many projects in order to develop 30 gigawatt in 15 years. So it's not to wait for everything being in place, but it's to have a global view in order to have financing, to have technologies, of course, to have legal framework, and to have everything in place in order to enable the key players to scale the technology.
Yes, please.
Yeah, maybe.
And then I'll have a quick question to Jean-Marc, but please.
Okay. Now, just maybe to add on emerging countries, because I think that all what has been said is perfectly and more available and accurate for emerging countries. I think that the more PPP legal framework could be developed, the more options could be found to decrease exchange risk, the more solutions could be found to develop or to decrease offtake risk, and the more pension funds, the more investors will come. So that's what we're trying to do on our own, trying to provide guarantees on exchange risk, trying to fine-tune solutions to decrease this exchange risk in project finance, and trying with our parent company to help scaling up the legal frameworks so that PPPs could be really affordable and could be really acceptable for investors.
Don't worry, I'll come back to you in a second, but Jean-Marc, I have two questions for you now. The first one is, can you give us, you are the consultant, so basically you're supposed to be the most objective from all of us. So
I have clients, you know.
I'll try, you'll try. I know you're going to do best. That's the first question. And the second one is really, I mean, if we come back to the 2 degrees increase, mean, can we leave aside the nuclear issue completely, or do we need to reincorporate this topic in this climate issue or question? Two questions for you.
Yeah, I'm going to answer the second one with a very short word because I don't want to debate here of something which is absorbing all the rest. So the answer is no.
Okay.
If we don't want nuclear, you just can forget 2 degrees. I mean, you will have to forget 2 degrees, most probably, even if you include nuclear. But if you want to waive nuclear, you can just forget it. I wanted to come back to something we're answering the first question, which is actually, what is a 2-degree compliant infrastructure? Because that's the question. And actually, what is a 2-degree compliant project? If you want to be 2-degree compliant, the first thing is that you have to invest into some project that avoids emissions and not that comes on top of the existing object that keep the same emissions. So you have to substitute something. You cannot just add something clean on top of something dirty that remains, because if we just keep the present emissions, we already missed the 2-degree objective. The second thing is that you have, when you invest into an infrastructure, you have what we call locked-in emissions. For example, if you invest into a highway, even if you turn all the cars electric with carbon-free electricity in 30 years, you have an amount of time, a number of years for which you will use the highway with the present cars running on oil. And so you have a carbon budget which is associated to what you finance and that you just cannot avoid because you will use what the present technology offers you. And the idea, so assessing a 2-degree infrastructure is basically looking at whether the carbon budget of the infrastructure is compliant with the carbon budget of humanity to be 2-degree compatible. So we are presently launching at Carbon 4 a method, because methods is what we do at Carbon 4. We have begun a long time ago by designing the first carbon footprint for AFD project. That was over 10 years ago. Then we have worked with, so it's going from the, with Philippe on a method called CIA, nothing to do with the US, carbon impact analytics that looks at the whether a company is compliant with the climate objective regarding its carbon footprints, the emissions that it may avoid in its client's perimeter, etc. Then we have developed a method called CRIS for climate risk and impact screening that looks at the vulnerability of companies regarding climate change. And so now we are launching the 2 Infra Challenge with AFD, again, La Banque Postale AM, and Meridiam, that will look at whether an infrastructure is 2 or only 3 or only 4 or only 5 or only 6 degree compatible. Because of course, you're not necessarily 2-degree compatible when you do something today. And it's based on the idea of the carbon budget. One thing to keep in mind regarding the report that was released by the IPCC this morning, or yesterday, I don't remember. If you look at the locked-in emissions of the present infrastructure, we're already over 1.5 degree. So if we remove nothing to the present infrastructure, just use them until their end of life, and stop and put all you people out of business. You don't invest a single euro starting tomorrow. Still, we are over 1.5 degree. So that's, again, the metrics are going to show that we have something in front of us, and that connects with what Philippe has just said. If I'm a little more provocative than him, enough conferences, let's act. And that's basically what we try to do. We try to provide methods that enable people to act.
Nicolas, coming back to pure investment vehicles, how do you cope with this necessity of triggering the climate into your business? Can you give us some examples, live examples of what you're doing, probably in Southern Europe?
A few thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think Europe has been at the lead of renewables and has set an example for the rest of the world. If you look at the last 20 years, some of the largest companies, for example, Siemens, is the global leader of offshore wind. There are many other examples. I mean, Europe has really set an example. Today I read that Morocco has announced that they have a 50% target of renewables by 2050 and are going to invest 40 billion euros or dollars. Obviously, Morocco is looking north at Europe as an example. So Europe has to continue to be an example on what's needed in the next 20 years. And it's not just building more renewables capacity, it's electrifying transport. And that's a very big challenge for, and I don't think Europe right now has a clear strategy on how to do that. It's very fragmented. Each country is, doing all kinds of different things. And you have a huge, incumbent lobby against that, which is the car manufacturers. But I think Europe has to take the lead on in front of the rest of the world, and not just investing in renewable solar, PV, et cetera, but also in transforming the economy. And finally, I think there's an issue of public perception. At this level, obviously, everybody knows about the 2-degree objective, but most people in the street have don't really think about that, and they don't really, worry about that. And you have lots of people who are complaining about wind farms because they don't like the look of them, but they're not really thinking about their, their grandchildren at all. So I think there's a lot of education that has to be done with young people, especially, so that they think about energy efficiency, because and using energy in a much more productive way. And Europe has to find a way of continuing to set an example in front of the rest of the world, despite the efforts of the US to slow things down. And I think Europe can do that.
Thank you. Emmanuel, can I ask you to explain us a little bit more between the methodology you're using and the geography you're investing in? Basically, one of your example of what you're doing against global warming.
Yeah, maybe clarifying what the new methodology we have decided to use for since the beginning of the year. What we have decided, as I was briefly explaining it, is to first of all make sure that if we are to support the financing of an emissive project, it is because it is clearly in the low carbon trajectory of a country. That means that at the same time, whilst they are aiming to, for instance, invest in that highway because it's the sole highway which can allow development in a country, they are committed at the same time in terms of renewable energy to decrease emissions they do have on their electricity mix, for instance. So that's first, and the second is really to pay attention on the asset itself and try to see whether it doesn't lock a different option that could be implemented on a medium-term basis. For instance, shall we finance and support a specific highway? Isn't it possible on a medium-term basis after feasibility study or whatever to have a railway as option that could be developed and that could be less emissive and that could match and fit with the requirements of that highway? So yeah, that's briefly and naively explained, but the idea is really to focus and pay attention more and more on each asset we want to support when it is really emissive, and not to sign a blank check, and to be more and more selective on the assets we would be financing. And this is brand new.
Thank you, Xavier. You are the largest producer. Can I just ask you of electricity, out of the 10 billion you were mentioning of annual capex, how much of these capex are bound to reduce somehow the global warming? If you can, I know the question is a bit odd, but if you can tell us a bit more about this.
No, I mean it's not odd. I mean I mean, in our capexes, I mean, as a whole, we invest a bit more than 4 billion per year in the existing nuclear facilities. We invest more or less 2 billion in the UK for new nuclear facilities. We invest more or less 2 billion in renewables generation utilities in France, and of course on the international footprint. We are a key player, for example, in the US, in Brazil, for example. And for the rest, we invest significantly in distribution networks and in smart meters for more or less 4 billion these days. And of course, this is not directly linked with the climate 2 degrees objective, but it's linked to energy efficiency. So as an investor, we are a key contributor, and I can tell you that we really consider this criteria very seriously in our investment committees. We do not only focus on strategic analysis or on financial analysis, but we also, on a case-by-case basis, analyze the consequences of this or that investment on our commitment towards minus 40% CO2 emission in 2030, in order to check that we are consistent on a case-by-case basis with our global commitment. And we are also considering how to deal with that objective as a financial investor, because as you may know, we are also a financial investor, what we call the dedicated assets that we have to develop in order to hedge our long-term nuclear liabilities. These days, we have invested 28 billion euros on this project, and we are considering how to integrate this goal also as a financial investor. Of course, it's very demanding, but it's something that we consider fully consistent with our global commitment.
Thank you. Philippe, please, because I mean, we're still 5 minutes left to the end.
A couple of things.
Yeah, a couple of things.
First, I wanted to congratulate Jean-Marc, because he's, the way he say, I don't want to open the debate, and then he closes the debate. I mean, it's really... No, just joking. No, I think we have... maybe coming back to the appetite of the investors. Yes, there is a big appetite of the investors about infrastructure, but again, it's always the same infrastructure. And when we measure the green assets, I don't know, you already published these figures. Can I say these figures or no? Yeah, it's only between 1.5 and 2% of the assets of the institutional investors in France, which are invested in green assets. These figures come from the, the Article 173, the fact that all the investors have to measure and publish the carbon footprint of a portfolio. And at the end of the day, they only invest between 1.5 and 2% in what they call themselves green assets. So this is a first issue. Second one is that this appetite is also, I mean, the major part of this is an investment in brownfield infrastructure funds. So I can understand that we can start by investing in greenfield in public funds and then transfer it to the private side. But I think that the private investors should also invest in greenfield infrastructure. And if the majority of the market, of the infrastructure market in developed countries, focused on just buying the infrastructures from one to another, I think it would be a big issue of focusing on only transaction and not putting the infrastructure out of the ground, which is at the end of the day the real objective we have to fulfill.
Thank you. I mean, I was kindly asked to be the moderator. It's the first time I'm a moderator, so I would like this roundtable not to end as a fight. But Jean-Marc, can you answer Philippe's comments, because you were quite...
No, I don't want to answer Philippe. We'll do that when there are only the two of us, and that we can leave our shirts aside. No. No, I just wanted to point out that there are currently works being performed at the European Commission with the technical expert group. That's something I wanted. Might seem to be a detail, but something which is major for me is that there is an option between naming the object or naming the action. I'm afraid that the Commission is going to head towards naming the object. If you invest into a windmill or a solar panel, it's going to be green no matter what, even if it doesn't allow to get rid of a single coal power plant. If you invest into an electric car, it's going to be green, even if the electricity is produced with coal. On the other hand, if you invest into coal, even if it's to decrease the emissions of an existing coal power plant, it's not green because it's in coal. That's naming the object. Naming the action is that whatever you do, in whichever sector you invest, any brownfield project for which the emissions after investment are lower than the emissions before investment is green. The second option, of course, is good for my business because you have to calculate all the time. But more seriously, it's the only thing which is good for the emissions, because in the first case, you cannot prove in no way that you are going to finance something which is effectively going to curb the emissions down. So I just wanted to conclude on this point, because methods are always at the root of action. So if you have the wrong method, you will have the wrong action.
Maybe just one word to answer. I do not agree. No, I think the work which has been done by the Commission on the taxonomy, I think it's very important. Of course, we have to do it smartly, of course. But defining green assets is very important, and unfortunately, the news are not very good. The taxonomy work is not going very rapidly at the Commission level, and the last news I have is that it probably won't be possible for the Commission to have this taxonomy agreed before the end of this Commission next year, which is not good. I mean, there was a very huge momentum after the high-level expert group and the action plan of the Commission, and now. Because of a lot of, let's say, I mean, we have to say it, a lot of lobbying from some of the member states, which are just want to defend, I mean, to protect certain kind of industry. We are not going in the right direction today.
Thank you. Unless one of you would like to conclude or add a word, I think it's time to come to an end. And on behalf of the audience, thank you very much for having answered us.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been an extraordinary day, I think. The fact that so many of you are still here at 7 o'clock at night makes me wonder whether Paris nightlife is not all it's cracked up to be these days. But a great panel session to close on, an important panel to close on.